Welcome to the September edition of our 2025 series of Down to Earth webinars. These will cover a broad range of subjects and are available afterwards on our YouTube channel alongside our previous talks. Our talk today will be given by Richard Brinkworth, a director within RSK. Richard will give us an insight into the impact of bias and assumptions in undertaking our investigations and assessments. But firstly, a brief note on housekeeping during the talk. All attendees' microphones are automatically muted throughout the webinar. During the presentation, you can post questions online and there'll be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. We'll answer as many questions as possible at the end of the talk, but those that can't be answered due to time constraints will be answered after the webinar. Shortly after the webinar, you will receive a link to a short survey. If you can take a few minutes to provide feedback so we can improve on our future webinars. Now, please let me introduce our speaker today. Richard is Divisional Operations Director within RSK's Geosciences and Engineering Division. He has over 30 years experience in the industry and is a highly regarded civil engineer specializing in complex site investigations and design and implementation of specialist remediation schemes for contaminated land. Richard is a specialist in his field and lectures at industry conferences, local authority forums, and academic institutions, sharing his knowledge from the industry, as well as his thought leadership on understanding the complexity of expert assessment. RSK delivers staff training through from graduate to leadership level, and in his role as Ops Director, Richard provides training to our senior management staff to steer them as future leaders within RSK. I'll hand over to Richard now to provide an overview of the challenges of assessing data objectively and the influence of bias on our assessment. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, Hugh. And yeah, as you said, afternoon, everyone. I am going to put my camera off while we run through the presentation, and then we'll put that back on at the end of the presentation for questions, which hopefully there will be a few. And so, yeah, please be thinking of those. You should also note during the presentation, we've got a couple of polls. So this is an interactive session. So hopefully you can engage in those as well. It's not complicated questions, and they'll come up towards the start. So hopefully you'll join in on that too, and we'll get going on that basis. So today we're talking about bias and bias in sort of human judgment, really. But really with reference to experts. So it's probably sort of safe to say that the people watching out there are in some way expert in their field. And by that, I mean someone who's got knowledge accrued in some sort of accredited fashion, and someone that can operate with a high degree of independence as a result of that knowledge. And as experts, you'll all have very, very capable brains. In fact, so capable that you'll have no difficulty reading this slide, which has been intentionally put up sideways. It's not just because I don't know how to drive PowerPoint. And even if I were to offer you a paragraph that on the face of it doesn't make any sense, your brain will very competently be able to reconstruct that into a sentence that makes sense. If there are any people from Scotland on the call, then the second word you may struggle with, because obviously that is a real word for you, and so that might be difficult to reconstruct into the word that I'm intended. However, the basic point is you're pretty clever people and you can do lots of clever things. However, experts haven't had the greatest press of late, and our good friend Mr. Gove in 2016 said that he thought that the people of this country had had enough of experts And specifically, he referred to experts from organisations with acronyms saying that they know what's best and getting it consistently wrong. Now, I don't know whether he meant the organisations with acronyms or the experts spouting out acronyms, but either which way, much as it pains me to say, he might have had a bit of a point. Because the trouble with experts is that they are going to be wrong more often than they think they are, and by a greater margin than they ever would expect to be, and for reasons that are entirely predictable. Contentious statement. So we have a little poll for you here, and all you need to do is pick which of the poll responses relates to the image that you saw first. I'll give you a couple of minutes to just answer that poll. That's quite interesting. So we've got the majority of the results back in on that one. And more of you there saw a duck and a rabbit. Nothing in that in particular. In fact, quite considerably more saw the duck than the rabbit. But I want you now to just take a moment to switch between the two images of the duck and the rabbit, assuming that you can see both. Hopefully everyone can work out the two. And now I'm going to ask you to just relax, because what will have happened in that moment where you were comparing the two images is that your pupils will have dilated, your blood pressure and pulse will have increased, because getting your brain to switch between those two things will have been effortful. So another poll coming up now for what hopefully might be a fairly simple observation for you. So all you need to do on the poll here is say which line is longer, top one, bottom one, or are they the same? I'll open up the poll again on that one. So quite a good result there, and as we might have expected, the majority of people think that the lines are the same. Now, obviously, the majority of the people also probably don't know me personally or know that I'm a bit of a swine when it comes to things like this, and that yes, I have made the lines a different length. And so those of you who did say bottom, well done. But that is simply not an error on your part to assume that they're the same. It's something that you've seen loads of times before, and it's a fair assumption to make that they would have been the same length. But that's sort of what we're leaning into here, is that where we make assumptions and we aren't objective and we don't check our thinking, that's where errors can creep in. And this is really the sort of basic premise of the bias and noise that we're going to be talking about in a bit more detail this afternoon. So specifically thinking about the line problem, there'll be a number of cognitive biases that will impact your decisions as experts. And the biggest risks are going to come from confirmation bias to your past experiences. So expecting that those two lines are always the same is a reasonable assumption, and therefore you would jump to that one and add that one as your response. But also availability bias to solutions that we're sort of generally familiar with. And perhaps more interestingly, if you start to believe that a particular conclusion is true, you're also then thereafter very likely to believe that arguments that appear to support it, even if those arguments are pretty unsound. And just building on that theory a bit more, the confidence that you have in those beliefs will actually depend more on the quality of the story that you tell about that evidence, rather than the quality or the quantity of it, even if there isn't actually very much evidence to see, even if there isn't much to see in the story. So it is quite interesting that we are typically quite biased towards casual explanations. Our minds don't really deal well, particularly with statistics, even if we're quite statistically aware. So even sort of quite well-educated and mathematically minded people don't necessarily think statistically by default. And that can give us a confusion between correlation and causation, which we could call unwanted causal inference. And that applies even to the most eminent of academics, as well as those of us in professional practice. These concepts are really neatly explained in a couple of books. And one of the things Hugh mentioned on the introduction about the leadership training that we do in RSK, one of the big things that we do as part of that leadership training is signpost lots of books that we suggest our aspiring future leaders should read. These are two that we definitely recommend, and lots of the things that we're talking about today are covered in these two books by Daniel Kahneman. Put simply, these concepts can be summarized as noise being the unwanted variability of judgment, and bias, which exists when most of the errors in a set of judgments are in the same direction. So that's quite a difficult thing to explain in words. We've got a pictorial explanation in a minute, but if we think about the distinction between the two things, and in particular when we're looking at decisions that have gone badly and we look back over those, it's quite often easy to find bias, but less easy to find noise. And those two books go into a lot of detail around some of the ways that you can unpick that. So just to kind of expand on that and explain what we mean a bit more pictorially, what we're talking about with a noisy system is just decisions that are kind of very variable all over a particular accurate outcome, whereas our biased decisions would all be variable in or collected in a particular sort of direction, and then when we've got noise and bias applying together, then we've got variability, but all leaning in a particular direction. So although we're talking about judgment here today, one sort of useful and fairly common understanding in our industry is in relation to contamination tests, where we might have a lot of noise in the results of a range of contamination tests. And were we to have, for example, some equipment error in the lab, then we might well have some bias where the results are all sort of showing the same error in the same direction. But that's not specifically what we're talking about today. It just gives you a sort of point of reference. We're talking more about the judgments that we make. So to sort of summarize the way that the brain is computing and how bias is coming in, the books talk about the difference, the distinction between the system 1 brain, so quick thinking, and the system 2 brain, so more effortful and rational thinking. And that's where the fast and slow comes from. That's in the title of the book and this presentation. So our fast brain is going to be intuitive and efficient. It's always on, it's always thinking. It doesn't require any effort, but isn't great at recognizing ambiguity, doesn't question or check what it thinks, and is therefore prone to bias and rationality. Whereas our slow system 2 brain is our conscious thinking, which is lazy and inefficient, but is careful and rational. And it does take effort to turn it on, which in terms of the duck and rabbit thing, you know, we will have had to have sort of deploy our conscious brain to switch between the two images. It does demand careful attention, and it looks for evidence. It is aware of doubt and ambiguity, but critically here it thinks it's in charge, and it thinks it knows the reasons for its choices. But actually, more often than not, your system 1 brain, your fast thinking, is doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and may well be in charge more often than you think. So this is a simple sort of example that's explained in the book, but just the concept of being able to spot quite quickly that the number of blocks on the ground, the two towers are clearly the same height, and that's quite easy to spot, but you've got to sort of try a bit harder to work out that the number of blocks in the tower is the same as the number of blocks on the ground. And you know, that sort of effortful thinking is the distinction that we're making here. There's hundreds of examples in the book, and it's very convincing in terms of how it explains the distinction, and even those most skeptical readers tend to be able to be convinced by the end of it that there is certainly something in this. There's lots of examples of priming in there, which is essentially a pretty common technique that advertisers use. Includes your sort of double glazing salesman who'll who'll drop a number into a conversation and then ask you to think of a number that your new double glazing is going to cost, and if he starts with a high number, you're going to follow with an equally high number. In the example in the book, there was a cohort of people that were asked to test a new pair of headphones, sports headphones, and they were fed some radio editorials through the headphones whilst being asked to either shake, so left to right movement of their head, and trying to shake the headphones off their head, or nodding backwards and forwards. The people who nodded backwards and forwards tended to accept the message that they heard, whereas those that shook their head left and right tended to reject it. And these sort of kind of what on the face of it seem like incredulous results of testing are repeated over and over again in the book. Another good example was two cohorts of people that were asked to do questionnaires, one with a set of questions relating to old age and one with a set of questions relating to youth, and they were then asked to just walk to a second room for another test. And in fact, the assessment was purely based on the time they took to walk to the second room. It was nothing to do with the set of questions they were being asked. And those who answered the questions on youth tended to walk faster to the second room than those who answered the questions on old age. So these things are very evident, and you know, something that we are subjected to quite a lot in day-to-day life, although we may not believe that it has that much effect on us. It actually does. So obviously what we're really interested in is what we can do about that. And I suppose another way of kind of phrasing that would be how we can sort of tame our intuition, our intuitive thinking. So in the industry that we're in, ground investigation, geotechnical and geoenvironmental consulting, we can think about the sorts of questions that we ask ourselves. So if, for example, we have questions like, are sites like this often contaminated, or what does my usual method, survey method show, then that might lead to bias in a way that questions like, why might the site be contaminated, or what do I need to know, and what do I know, and what do I still not know, might actually open us up to more mindful consideration that might in turn then compensate for bias. So thinking along the lines of what have I looked for and what have I found, which on the face of it looks very similar to the previous set of questions, but just is slightly more mindful and evocative. So quite often in our lines of work as engineers, we'll be presented with situations that require forecasts or estimates. And we might use lookup tables or analyses from previous occasions. And we might often find that a solution comes to mind really, really quickly because there's a lot of familiar cues being recognised in the situation that we're looking at. But those initiative sort of predictions tend to be biased, and therefore they need to be corrected. And whilst that will still potentially give rise to errors, even if we strip out all the bias we can, those errors will then become smaller and won't favour high or low outcomes. So we tend to be sort of regressing to the mean the more that we correct our biases. So in sort of simple summary terms for consultants, we're obviously particularly in the ground engineering industry, we're dealing with complex systems, and quite often we're dealing with very limited amounts of data. And overall, there's a big conflict in trying to deliver a straightforward, striking, persuasive message, whilst also recognizing that there's a significant degree of uncertainty in that message, and that can lead to oversimplification. And that obviously is something that we're trying to avoid. But it is a fact that the world makes actually less sense than we think, and what coherence we think we've got in our mind tends to come from good stories that provide a simple and coherent account of someone's actions and intentions. And on the whole, we will tend to fool ourselves by constructing flimsy accounts of the past and believing them to be true. So that whole process is quite difficult to or effortful to avoid. So we can get around this by obviously challenging those perceptions and assumptions, that intuitive thinking, and we can push ourselves to not answer the same way as we usually do. And we can also question others in the team, and obviously a good example of that is a very robust peer review. And one of the things that geosciences do is, for example, to make a distinction between a technical peer review and then just the sort of administrative check of their reports. And this is something the later talks in the series will go into in more detail in terms of the quality of reporting. But broadly speaking, that distinction then helps for a more challenging peer review in terms of the technical considerations and the judgment that may have arisen or may have brought some bias with it. On the client side, if there are any clients on the call, And certainly in terms of when you're specifying work for subcontractors, you do need to think about the questions that you're asking, and specifically asking questions that are independent of the methods that are going to be used to answer the question. But broadly speaking, if there's only one thing to take away from the whole conversation, it is that we all need to understand that bias will affect outcomes, and therefore, as clients, we can challenge our consultants to consider uncertainty, bias, and noise in their assessment. Because broadly speaking, what we're talking about here is finding needles in haystacks, albeit often, as I say, with low amounts of actual evidential data to back up our decision making. So as in this case, if we're looking for a cow in a field of sheep, albeit oddly represented AI generated beasts that don't massively look like sheep in this particular case, but however, if we're looking for the cow here, then obviously it's quite important that we do make sure that it is a cow in reality, and not just that we've assumed what that cow looks like. So in broad summary, what we're looking to achieve here is slower thinking, and taking an objective approach. So posing in questions that are independent of the methodology used to get answers, selecting approaches that are based on objective analysis, being aware of how bias is going to affect the outcome, and taking steps to minimize it. But comes with a health warning, because if we start to correct our intuitions a lot, our lives might get more complicated. If we expect predictions to be wrong more often, so if we try and really manage our own bias in our predictions, then we'll tend to regress to the mean, and we'll tend to push ourselves away from our guesses that are rare or far away from the mean. So that might mean that we make less risky decisions. Now, that could be a great thing, and certainly in terms of the industry of risk assessment, that's probably a very valuable thing, but perhaps it's not always valuable in all aspects of your life. So it is something to bear in mind, specifically because the absence of bias might not always be the most important aspect in the decision making that you're doing, and obviously that is going to sort of constrain that, but not necessarily help you make a better decision in the round. And one thing to bear in mind as a sort of summary piece here is that generally system one is affected by your mood. So if you're happy or uncomfortable, uncomfortable, I should say, when you're making decisions, then that tends to lose touch a bit with your intuition, and it would tend to make your thinking more conscious and more effortful. So I guess in summary, what we could say is that we might have chosen to actually call this talk Assessing Cold and Grumpy rather than assessing fast and slow, because that might help us to make more conscious and considered decisions. So that's the end of the formal talk, and thank you all for joining us on that. We're now going to open the questions up and pop our cameras back on, which Hugh has already done.
Yes, thank you, Richard. That was really interesting. Having heard it before, it was really good to hear it again. And actually, there's a few other points that have popped up in my head. But we've got a number of questions coming in.
Okay.
Pose a couple of these to you while I wait for more questions to come through. What bias might using a report template bring in versus starting a report from scratch?
Yeah, that's a good one. Obviously, I think most people probably are now using some sort of templates for things, and clearly they give you the structure for a report that you're doing. I would say that there is a risk if the template goes too far in assisting with the decision making. So whilst there's a really important structure piece and there's a really important signposting piece in terms of the sorts of things, the sorts of analyses that you can do, if it were to lean too much into sort of decisions and outcomes, then you might potentially just trip into that sort of making judgments based on previous experience only and not stepping back and actually considering this case, because quite often we've got, as we keep saying, small amounts of data that we're dealing with here. So the little oddities can sometimes be a bit overlooked because they're not really sort of jumping out at you, but actually sometimes they can be a bigger part of the story than they might look at first grasp. Yeah.
No, that's quite interesting, because I've had through my career different directors who have pushed one way or the other in terms of when you follow a report template. Obviously, all the cues are there, as you say, but that you kind of turn your brain off. So, yeah.
Yeah.
The next question, this is interesting. Does using prior site data improve or prejudice an assessment?
Yeah, there's a whole rabbit hole of a debate. Yeah, my view is more data the better, as a very top level view. So, and you know, keep mentioning that we're often sort of being forced to work with small amounts of data. So certainly, yeah, more info we've got to base our judgments on, the better. But that has to be weighed against whatever uncertainty comes with that set of data. So if it was older and done on sort of less robust kit, or you know, has potentially got bigger error in it for whatever reason, but you can pick that up in your consideration of uncertainty. And again, it just comes down to just being really robust and honest about what we don't know. And it's really easy to just kind of jump to the, well, we do know this because this is always this. But actually just really questioning ourselves about what we don't know is pretty important.
And as you say, a key step in that, you know, assessment process on the site, to go through that step of uncertainty. No, that's really good. Thank you, Richard. Another interesting one here. Is there a risk of AI pushing assessment more towards a biased focus?
Yeah. Well, if the last one was a rabbit hole, then this one's a black hole. So, I mean, AI has AI has a risk of being only biased, because it will only draw on the experiences that it draws on. Now, that might not be what one would hope. It isn't just the experiences of a single individual, but it might be the experiences of a single organization, and it will be something that we will have to watch, I think, in the context of, again, it's highly unlikely to question itself, so we will have to do that questioning. Yeah, I mean, just the breadth, you know, again, it's just an understanding of, it's an uncertainty consideration, it's an understanding of where that AI has drawn its conclusions from. So has it, if you gave it the question, should I pile a particular building, and it had only ever trained itself on piling company websites, it may well tell you that you should pile the building. And obviously understanding that backdrop of where that data's come from is just part of the assessment process, and something that we're all going to have to learn, because we don't probably yet know how much bias we're going to be thrown by the models. So yeah, one to watch.
Yeah, no, that would be brilliant.
Probably a whole series of chats rather than even just a follow-on chat. But certainly a follow-up on AI.
And one that's probably related to that is, how do we speed up interpretation of data without compromising the quality of the interpretation?
Yeah, well, again, yeah, definitely related, and not something that historically as an industry we've been great at either, in terms of sort of really having robust but efficient ways of assessing data. And you know, we've still got, I think, still a way to go on that. And clearly that sort of you know, a lot of the kind of noise I've made on the talk is really around more the case of not speeding up our assessment of data but slowing it down. Now that is different to our, if you like, preparation of data. So it'd be good to speed up this is the actual data. I mean, unfortunately, you know, we don't often have everything all in one place, all neatly arranged and all perfectly statistically assessed for us and all the rest of it, in order that we can then speed up our actual assessment. But it is that distinction of the evaluation and the assessment. So, you know, that kind of consolidation of information, of data, and then turning it into sort of a properly analysed data set should be able to be done quite quickly, in order that you can then spend more time actually making the right decision. But unfortunately, you know, it's quite often the case that we spend more time kind of tidying up data and getting to a point where we can analyse it, and then we have less time available to actually kind of make proper assessments and judgments.
No, that's really interesting. And I think, as you say, there's plenty of meat there for some future discussions and talks.
Yeah, certainly on sort of pulling data together and making judgments on it.
So we'll end the questions there, and further questions will be answered once Richard has had a chance to review these. So a big thank you to Richard for the talk and for answering those questions. Our next Down to Earth talk will be on the Tuesday, the 14th of October, and we'll look at remediation and treatment of groundwater. So please remember to complete the feedback following the presentation. And thank you for attending today, and we'll see you again in October.